Ideally, a refugee or migrant to another country should be prepared to live within the cultural norms in their new society.
A nation accepting migrants or refugees should make an attempt to understand their cultural and religious expectations.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Welcome to today's program. We're so very glad you've joined us. Looking forward to this discussion. Before we get started, I'd like for you to meet our panelists. We're going to ask them to introduce themselves and tell us just a little bit about what they do other than being on the panel as they are today. Let's begin with Bishop Olson.
My name is Bishop Olson, and I am the Bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Fort Worth, Texas.
My name is Canon John Peterson. I am an Episcopal priest, canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
I'm Tom Plumley. I'm the senior minister at First Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Our congregation is a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
I'm Andrea Luxon. I'm president of Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, which is affiliated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Hi, I'm Carl Troval. I'm the Richard J. Dinda Professor of Lutheran Identity and Mission at Concordia University in Austin, Texas, a university affiliated with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
And I am Mel Robeck, Senior Professor of Church History and Ecumenics and Special Assistant to the President for Ecumenical Relations at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. I'm also an Assemblies of God minister.
I thank you all for being here today. I'm looking forward to hearing what each of you has to say about today's subject. Let's get right to it. Every year, hundreds of thousands of refugees leave their homelands to seek asylum or a better life in another country. One of the largest migrations ever known was the recent migration of citizens of Syria through to Europe. They came to escape war and persecution. Many had lost their homes and seen family members killed. Now a significant number are making their way back to Syria, smuggled in as they were smuggled out. The reason they give for leaving a place of safety are varied. Often they relate to separation from family members still in their home country and the bureaucracies surrounding reuniting with those families. Nevertheless, in many cases, the reasons also include the clash of values between their world and that of the new country, where their children are given and expect more freedom, and where their own religious and or cultural norms are not, from their perspective, respected or valued. They return home to a place that may be unsafe physically, but where they will be with family. I would like for our panelists to consider these three questions, at least these three. Should a refugee to another country be expected to accept and work within all the values and cultural norms of their new country? Second question, to what degree should a country accepting refugees provide opportunities for them to fully live within the values and cultural religious frame they bring with them? And then finally, what examples does the panel have of transitions that have been successful? Well, that is our topic for today, and that will be our discussion and the questions that I hope we will consider around this table. Let's go back now to those who helped to begin the program. You were first, Canon Peterson. Tell us more of your thoughts on this subject, please.
Yes, I'd like to just start off by sharing some really horrific statistics. Since 2011, more than 5.5 million people have fled Syria. 6.1 million people have been displaced. And Syria's neighbors, in contrast to even what the thrust of our program is today, it is Syria's neighbors who have really accepted the huge majority of the displaced people. 3.3 million people in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, 650,000 in Jordan, 500,000, half a million of refugees in Europe, 50,000 in Canada, 18,000 in the United States. So when you see those figures, you can see who is really carrying the brunt of the exodus from Syria. It is that of the Middle East, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and in some ways parts of Europe. But it is also has to be said that this migration, the refugees, have destabilized much of the Middle East and reshaped certainly many asylum and migration problems. And here in the West, of course, there's a tremendous backlash. The thrust today, however, is not on the refugees returning from the Middle East, but the refugees that are returning basically from Europe. And so realistically, we have to say that the refugees that are returning from Europe is really a minor fraction in comparison to the ones that are returning from the Middle East itself. BBC followed a refugee by the name of Zachariah, who lived for 2 years in Germany before he decided he wanted to leave for home. And here are some of the things that he said. He always felt as an outsider. There was no attempt for him to be integrated within the context of German society. He said, I was not accepted. I did not achieve anything, not even 1%. When people looked at him, he felt that the Germans were afraid of him, that they saw him as a monster, not as a human being. He said that refugees were treated as terrorists rather than as Muslims. And so we have here really a critical situation dealing with refugees trying to integrate into society, but who do not feel that they're welcomed into the society, that they actually feel themselves seen by the local people. And here in this case with Zachariah, it was Germany, but certainly rest of Europe as well as the United States, frequently seeing them as terrorists instead of as Muslims.
Well, thank you very much. Bishop Olson, if you could elaborate your opening statement a little bit for us, please.
Well, I think that there's a distinction, I think, between refugees and immigrants that sometimes is easier to make in theory than practice, perhaps in reality, but I'll attempt to make it anyway, and that is, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that refugees want to return home to their families, precisely because the displacement of them should be temporary, but that they return to a place of peace and security as much as possible, and that any solution to the refugee crisis is not simply by us opening up our borders here indiscriminately and then people move here, but also has to involve an international solution about what is forcing and driving people out to begin with. What are the issues of injustice there with regard to family life, perhaps, or also religious expression or racial identification? These are all matters that are, since forcing refugees out, that are behind a lot of the wars and civil unrest in their home nations. I think with regard to immigration and our own response and understanding people from where they're coming as well is perhaps a difference in how we have done so in the United States. I mean, throughout our history, we've done very well as far as welcoming refugees. I think in a lot of ways leading, at least leading the world, maybe perhaps until recently. But I would say this about immigration. In the past, besides assimilation, there was an expectation not just that immigrants learn a new language, which they should learn, the dominant language, but that they actively and intentionally forget the prior language. And I think that what concerns me about that past practice is that it's very destructive of family life. It's very destructive of parental responsibilities to their children. In society, it places too much of a burden on children before their maturity, to be leaders in their family and society. And it also is really kind of contrary to education. Why should we be afraid of another language? And so those are my thoughts on this issue.
All right, thank you very much. We're off to a good start then. From some of the others on the panel, Dr. Luxton, what are your thoughts on this subject?
No, I think the trouble with the refugee crisis as we have it now is that we're talking about large groups moving somewhere. And it always makes it more difficult when you have a group arriving in large numbers. And I think that immediately changes the way they feel about the country they're going to and the country they are going to feel about them. Because there's a tendency to group, there's a tendency to be seen as forcing something new on a new environment. I think on the whole it's more successful when you have individuals or families moving in isolated numbers, and I think that works better. Having said that, I do think there's a kind of principle here. Are we richer or poorer when someone with a new perspective, new culture, new language comes into our environment? Does that enrich us or does it threaten us? Does it diminish us? And so I think we can do better in perhaps recognizing the fact that somebody new actually may bring something that is good for us, that will not threaten the status quo. That's very theoretical, I understand. In practice, it's much harder to implement. But I do think it's an important question that we need to ask ourselves.
All right, thank you very much. Reverend Plumley, your thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, thank you. I'm astounded by the desire to return, particularly to a place like Syria, where it's still so violent. People return to a home that no longer exists. I mean, literally, their house is gone. It's been bombed out or something, and there are landmines around where they used to farm, or there's unexploded ordnance in various places, and children are continually losing limbs and losing their lives because of things like that. To go back to a place that is still at war is I guess a real mark of just how discriminated against they feel in the place where they have gone. I read one refugee who talked about the feeling of constantly being made to feel that they were a burden. And that's an interesting way to think about it. Everybody that they met was reinforcing this feeling that, oh, you are not just that you're different, but that you are a burden to us. That their answer to Dr. Luxton's question would be, we are poorer because of your presence, immigrant, refugee. It's a horrible way to be made to feel, it's a tough way to live, a tough way to try to make a new life for yourself and your family.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robeck. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I find it interesting, that so many of these people, especially from Syria, went to other, what we would say, dominantly Muslim countries. In a sense, I would say they should feel at home. They should feel comfortable. There's a common religion, in many cases a common language. While cultures vary, it's much more nuanced within those contexts. I think where the real issue comes is people who have come to Western Europe, especially Western Europe, where expectations of what I would call the liberal Western values are, in a sense, demanded of these new immigrants who do not share those same values. And I've heard that complaint over and over again from refugees who say, they're trying to make us, take off our veils and, or accept homosexuality where we didn't accept it, or any other kind of sexual expression that is different from, say, a Muslim context, and so forth. So, there's a sense in which I feel for them at that particular point. And I have to say that refugees are, for the most part, very vulnerable people. And for us to make, or for Western European nations to make these kinds of expectations a forced reality, as in, say, Sweden, where they are now taking children that are 3 and 4 years old from the parents and trying to, in a sense, indoctrinate them into becoming Swedes, a forced assimilation in a real way. And it seems to me that perhaps Belgium is another country where this is, or Holland, I don't remember. But anyway, Western European countries, Northwestern, are doing these kinds of things. And I really think that's a terrible thing. And it's easy for us to look at that externally and say, well, they do that, but we wouldn't. And yet, when countries come to us can ask for funds, we will often tie those funds to a change in their value system to meet our value system. And I think that's equally inappropriate.
Oh, and we immigrants did this very same thing to the natives of this continent.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Trovall, your thoughts on the subject, please.
Yeah, there's a book written a number of years ago by Samuel Huntington who he talked about the clash of cultures. And the basic question he raises is, are there such fundamentally different values as you kind of have expressed between two different groups of people that they really can't live with one another in the same culture? Yeah. And I mean, I think this question just raises that issue up. And I mean, because I liked how you put it. Liberal Western values and Middle Eastern values can look quite different from one another. Yeah. And is there a possibility of assimilation? And that's a question I don't really know the answer to. I'd have to ask people in that situation. I do know that culture is quite authoritative in our lives. And it comes down as an authority as if it's from God, and it's hard to adjust to any new reality. As any of us who've traveled in other countries know, other cultures aren't failed attempts at being us. And that adaptation can be quite painful. And I think for us, again, it gets back into empathy and respect. A lot of these people are leaving not because they've wanted to, it's because they've been forced to. Yeah. And that we need to welcome them, to help them in their need. And if it's their choice to adapt to the values of their host country or to return, I think we need to enable people to do that.
It's the trauma of change, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everything changes. Not only have they moved to a different country, the food is different, the language is different, the religion is different. It could be a whole host of things. And is it any wonder then that they would want to go back to the land with which they are familiar, even if it's bombed out, as you were saying, Reverend Plumley? Why would they want to go back? It's a familiar place. Family is there.
But at the same time, we would not want people to try to force. If they come from a polygamous culture, we wouldn't want them to try to practice that here. If they come from a culture where they practice female genital mutilation, real strong sense of patriarchy, and father can beat people up in the family, and arranged marriages and all those kinds of things,
those are antithetical to the values of the West.
Bishop Olson, you wanted to add something to this, please.
I think that's I think human beings they're always going to involve language, and they're always going to involve culture, because those are distinguishing characteristics. Yeah. But the common characteristic is somehow humanity. The fact that we have these arranged things, and there's going to have that. I think that always has to ultimately that's the pivot point on which all of these things are finally adjudicated. And when we dehumanize other people and make them monsters, as they were, or just so alien, well, then we can't resolve these issues, and at least not peacefully.
So we come full circle. Back to Canon Peterson. You helped the beginning. You have one more thing to say. Well, got out of time.
The issue is, of course, the war. And most of the refugees who are returning home now are returning home from Lebanon, and as well as from Jordan. And they're returning for two reasons. One, returning to protect their own assets that they had at home, those assets that might still remain. And secondly, many of the areas to which they are returning now in Syria are safer areas. And so they feel safe being able to return. It's not war-torn anymore.
No, thank you. That adds a really good perspective on a very bad and sad situation. Terrible situation. Well, thank you. This has been a really good discussion. We'll probably be coming back to this subject because, unfortunately, it is so common within our world where this happens. But until we come back, I do want to say thank you for joining us today. We've had a great opportunity. There is an important announcement I'd like for you to hear. We'll be back in just a few moments.
Thank you, Pastor Lutz. We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you, Pastor Lutz, and today's closing statements.
Thank you, Mark, and I would like to welcome you back to the program. We're going to go to our summations in just a few moments, but I do want to say many of the discussions we have around this table come as a result of suggestions from viewers like you. So please send us those suggestions for future topics. We'll be happy to consider them. We might not be able to get around to it very quickly or perhaps even at all, but sooner or later we will take advantage of what you suggest to us and discuss those important topics. I'd like to begin with Bishop Olson. You're first for the summations.
The current refugee crisis and its also corresponding immigration crisis requires an international response, a response at home here, but also a response of collaboration among nations. It involves both relief and development and an end to war, and that requires cooperation on the part of all nations.
Thank you. Now, Reverend Plumley.
It requires cooperation among all nations, and I think it is something that religious communities tend to be really good at, particularly when we can sit down and talk together as people of faith, despite all our differences. I think one of the statistics that has not been mentioned specifically about the Syrian situation is I read that 43% of Syrian refugee children, wherever they have gone, 43% of them have not been able to access any form of education the entire time they've been there.
Dr. Trovall, your summation, please.
I went through a thought experiment, and I thought, well, what if I were in a war-torn area and everything is decimated, and I had to travel for safety somewhere in which I didn't know the language and didn't know the people. I would pray that there would be people who had generous hearts who would open themselves up to me. I wouldn't expect that I would have to live by what my standards were. I would want to adapt to that culture in some way, and to be profoundly grateful to God and to the people in front of me for opening their lives up. And I think, treat others as you want to be treated. I would hope that we could do that. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I support, in our tradition, Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services. It helps relocate people and give money to be hosts for people in need.
Thank you. Dr. Robeck, your summation now, please.
Yeah, I think this is something that cuts in both directions. I think that when refugees make their way into a new place, they have to be aware of the context in which they are going and try to fit in as much as possible. That's easy enough for me to say as a native-born American. Huh? I may be a conservative guy that is opposed to kind of, we'll call it the liberal Western values here in the United States, but I have found a way to live in that. At the same time, I think the nations that accept them need to be accommodating to the people who come. As much as possible, not force these kinds of things upon them as a benefit, if you would, for them coming and receiving welfare or whatever it is. Anything that we can do to change hopelessness into hope, anything that we can do to raise the level of expectations for themselves, anything we can do that would help them with employment, which would enable them to survive, I think that's what we need to do.
Well, thank you very much. And now, Dr. Luxton, your summation.
I think there are some core values and ways of thinking in certain countries that we can't expect that country just to change when someone else comes to them. So I think there is a sense of responsibility when you come to another country to recognize some of that. On the other hand, I think we shouldn't underestimate how challenging it is for someone to move from one country to another, particularly one such as Western Europe or the United States, where society is complex, very complicated. Yeah. And the culture shock of moving into that environment can be extremely difficult sometimes, especially if values. So I think we need to make sure we don't think of the person coming as less than in the way we respond.
All right, thank you. Now, Canon Peterson, your summation.
I mean, the situation in Syria is just horrific. It can't be described in any other way. And I think that we also have to say, while I use an example from Germany, I think Germany has had an open heart and has really gone the second, third, fourth, fifth mile to accommodate. It's the best that they could possibly accommodate and very laudatory. I would like to also be able to say, however, that I think that Dearborn, Michigan, is really a perfect example in our country where this assimilation has been able to take place and has taken place very effectively. And I think we have a lot to learn from Dearborn as they have taken in Middle Eastern cultures and traditions because of war, because of immigration, and all the other reasons that you can give. But here, I believe really Dearborn is a wonderful example for us to look at as a study and how we can really do it well.
Well, thank you. And thank you again, everyone, for being here. This has been an enlightening program. It's a very sensitive subject, and I hear that around the table, and I hear the concern as you express your opinions and points of view. And I've even heard some suggestions from a couple of us here as to how we might be able to help. Sometimes we question the power of one. What can one individual do? Well, there are a lot of things that our religious organizations certainly can do. So I would encourage you to speak with your leaders of your churches, your congregations, wherever you worship, and see what you might be able to do to reach out and help those who are in need, especially these refugees about whom we have spoken today. Well, thank you so much for joining us. The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And so now, friends, until next week at the same time and over this very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.